December 17, 1944, Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The air was frozen solid, the kind of cold that made breath turn to smoke and steel bite like ice. The forest slept beneath a blanket of snow, silent except for the distant rumble of tanks crawling through the mist. Then, the quiet shattered, a sound that ripped through the morning like a thunderclap. A burst of deep, rhythmic fire echoed between the trees. The Germans called it der Teufels Schreibmaschine, the devil's typewriter. To the Americans, it was the roar of the M2.50 caliber machine gun. That morning, Sergeant Alan Dwyer of the 101st Airborne huddled behind a frozen sandbag wall near Bastogne, gripping the handles of an M2 mounted on a tripod. His gloves were torn, his fingers stiff, his eyes fixed on the white void ahead. Snow fell softly, deceptively peaceful, until dark shapes began moving in the fog. The Germans were coming. When Dwyer squeezed the trigger, the forest erupted. The M2 spat fire and fury, the rounds carving through trees and men alike. The snow around him boiled with smoke and lead. Each burst thundered like vengeance itself. The men beside him said later they'd never heard a gun scream like that. Not the way his did. Before we go any further, if stories like this make you feel the weight of history, pause for a second. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. I read every single one. Are you in Texas? London? Warsaw? Let me know. And if you want more forgotten legends of courage and invention from the front lines of World War II, hit that like button and subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends. Now back to the snow. The Germans weren't facing an ordinary .50 cal that day. What they faced came from a shadow born years earlier, a secret hidden deep within the heart of an American testing ground across the Atlantic. 2 years before Bastogne burned, in January 1942, at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, Captain Howard Briggs walked alone through the echoing halls of a drafty armory. Rows of half-assembled weapons lined the benches, the air thick with the smell of oil and gunmetal. Briggs was quiet by nature, a man who measured his words and his thoughts. But inside, something darker simmered. Weeks earlier, a telegram had arrived, the kind no brother ever wants to read. We regret to inform you, his older brother, Sergeant Michael Briggs, had been killed in North Africa. His jeep had been ambushed near Kasserine Pass, torn apart by German fire. The weapon responsible had a name whispered in fear even among Allied ranks, the MG-42, Hitler's buzzsaw. It fired at nearly twice the speed of the M2 Browning, shredding everything in its path. To Howard, that telegram wasn't just a message. It was a challenge. The Army had assigned him to refine the already deadly M2.50 caliber, to make it more efficient, reliable, easier to mass produce. But while his superiors wanted precision, Briggs wanted punishment. His brother's death became an obsession, a quiet storm that pushed him past the limits of regulations. He wasn't improving a weapon anymore, he was building an answer. Late nights turned into early mornings at Aberdeen. Guards often found the lights still burning in the machine bays, the rhythmic clatter of metal echoing long after everyone else had gone. Briggs worked with a relentless intensity, dismantling the weapon piece by piece, studying recoil systems, feed belts, and barrel tension like a surgeon dissecting a heart. The M2 had already proven itself on jeeps and aircraft, but Briggs wasn't satisfied. He wanted something the Germans wouldn't understand. He began experimenting secretly, testing the gun under extreme cold, using modified recoil buffers scavenged from damaged prototypes, altering the feed mechanism against official protocol. His modifications were reckless, dangerous. But when he fired his creation during a snowstorm test in February 1942, witnesses said it sounded different. Not the clean mechanical beat of a normal Browning. It was harsher, angrier, as if the gun itself wanted revenge. Some engineers complained that the weapon overheated too fast. Others said it was too unstable for official approval. Briggs didn't care. He scribbled notes on a clipboard, his handwriting jagged from exhaustion. Cyclic rate increase viable. Recoil stabilization holds under pressure. Accuracy loss negligible. Proceed. But Aberdeen was a bureaucratic place. Orders mattered. Briggs's superiors discovered his unauthorized modifications and shut the project down. His prototypes were locked away, labeled unsafe for deployment. He was reprimanded, threatened with reassignment. For most men, that would have been the end. Not for Briggs. Weeks later, 2 crates marked for scrap disposal vanished from the loading docks. Inside were the modified weapons, his weapons. No record, no paperwork. Just gone. Months passed. The war spread across continents. Then strange reports began trickling in from the front lines. In Sicily, a German half-track had been cut in half by what soldiers described as a wall of fire. In Italy, Luftwaffe pilots reported seeing tracer rounds thicker than anything the Americans had before. Commanders dismissed it as exaggeration. Combat made men see ghosts. But the stories kept coming. By 1943, whispers started circulating through the army. Rumors about a version of the M2 that could fire faster, hit harder, and tear through enemy vehicles like paper. No one knew where it came from. No one could trace its serial numbers. The official line called it superstition. But in quiet corners of the Ordnance Department, some officers started calling it something else, Briggs' revenge. Back in Maryland, Briggs kept his silence. He'd already been demoted to a minor testing position. His career was finished. But at night, he'd sit in his quarters, radio tuned low to war reports, listening for mentions of his gun. When he heard about Bastogne, he smiled faintly. Because by then, his design had found a new home, across the ocean, in the hands of a secret division of the 8th Air Force in England. These were men who specialized in modifying aircraft weaponry, tinkerers, rogues, and mechanics who operated outside the lines. They'd somehow acquired Briggs' blueprints and built their own versions, mounting them on bombers and fighter escorts. They called it the Reaper. The first test came during a bombing raid over Bremen. When German fighters swarmed a formation of B-17s, the gunners unleashed a storm of .50 caliber fire, so dense it looked like a wall of molten light. For Messerschmitts went down before they could even fire a burst. Radio chatter that night carried one haunting line from a Luftwaffe survivor. They have a new weapon. It burns the sky. Back at the front, soldiers like Sergeant Dwyer never knew the name Briggs. They didn't know about the nights in Maryland or the telegram that started it all. All they knew was that when they pulled the trigger, the gun roared like something alive, something ancient and furious. In the Ardennes that winter, when the German armored push tried to break through the Allied lines, the M2 stood its ground. Mounted on tanks, jeeps, and foxholes, it became the line between survival and oblivion. Soldiers said the Germans started to fear the rhythm, the heavy, thudding cadence of the weapon that could cut through snow, armor, and morale all at once. The Devil's Typewriter didn't just fire bullets. It wrote history. As night fell over the frozen forest, the gun fell silent again, steam rising from its barrel, snow settling on its metal frame. Dwyer stared at it for a long time, breathing hard, not yet knowing that what he held wasn't just an American weapon. It was a personal promise, forged by a man thousands of miles away who'd sacrificed everything to make sure his brother's death would not be forgotten. But the real story, the truth about how that promise had reached the battlefield, was darker than anyone realized. Because soon, someone inside the army would start asking questions. Someone would notice those missing crates. And what they'd uncover would reveal that the weapon which saved countless Allied lives might have also cost one man his soul. By early 1944, whispers of a mysterious Super Browning had drifted from the front lines to the corridors of the U.S. Army Ordnance Department in Washington, D.C. Memos marked confidential crossed desks faster than gun barrels cooled. Something unusual was happening at the front. Weapons without serial records, components that didn't match factory specifications, and gunners describing performance no engineer could explain. Behind one of those desks sat Major Edward Carson, a logistics officer whose job was to make sense of chaos. He'd never fired a machine gun in his life, but he knew numbers, and the numbers didn't lie. Crate hashtag M2-4786 had been logged at Aberdeen, but the same serial number appeared months later in England. Either someone was stealing weapons or the army had a ghost in its system. Carson started digging. Each paper trail ended the same way. Signatures blurred, requisitions unsigned, records lost in transit. When he called Aberdeen for clarification, the clerk hesitated before answering. "Sir, that line item was handled directly by Captain Briggs." The name meant nothing to Carson at first. But when he pulled the personnel file, something felt off. The reports described a man brilliant but insubordinate, demoted after unauthorized modifications, then quietly reassigned. Yet in the margins of one memo, scrawled in pencil, were 4 words that caught his attention. He said it worked. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the war was accelerating toward its bloodiest crescendo. The Allies were preparing for D-Day, and every gun, tank, and plane mattered. At an airbase near Cambridge, a secret hangar buzzed with nocturnal activity. Mechanics worked under dim lights, welding, cutting, testing. Inside, a handful of engineers under the 8th Air Force's Experimental Division were mounting Briggs-style .50 calories on bomber turrets. They had no authorization, only results. Their leader, Lieutenant Hank Mallory, had once served as an armorer on the B-17 Memphis Belle. He'd seen firsthand how German fighters could tear apart a formation before the bombers reached their targets. To him, the standard M2 wasn't enough. When a crate arrived from the States with parts for testing only, he recognized the differences immediately: reinforced barrels, recalibrated buffers, modified belts. The weapon purred smoother, roared louder. He didn't ask who built it. He just mounted it. On the morning of June 6, 1944, D-Day, those modified guns roared over Normandy. Each burst from the sky rained down with surgical precision. German flak crews were obliterated before they could adjust their aim. Pilots later said the new Brownings didn't jam once, even after hours of continuous fire. To them, it felt supernatural, as if the weapon had no limit. But in Washington, Major Carson's investigation was becoming dangerous. He'd found a pattern: dozens of unrecorded shipments leaving Aberdeen under maintenance testing codes, all during Briggs's final months there. One requisition form had a handwritten destination: 8th AF, Cambridge Division. He realized the unauthorized weapon now flew above Europe. The Army had unknowingly fielded an illegal design. Carson's superiors wanted it buried. "The war comes first," they told him. "If it's saving lives, let it be." But Carson couldn't shake the feeling that something darker pulsed beneath those reports. He sent one final inquiry to Aberdeen, a request for any surviving notes from Captain Briggs. Weeks later, a package arrived. Inside, water-stained pages filled with dense calculations, recoil formulas, and a single chilling sentence written across the last sheet: "They must feel it." Back in Europe, Briggs himself was no longer behind a desk. In late '44, he had managed to get himself transferred to the front as a technical inspector. Officially, he was there to advise mechanics on weapon maintenance. Unofficially, he wanted to see his creation in battle. He arrived in Belgium just as the snow began to fall. He traveled between units, quiet and unassuming, never revealing who he truly was. Soldiers remembered a thin man with tired eyes who watched the guns more than he spoke. When he heard the M2's rhythm across the lines, that thudding, furious tempo, he would pause and listen, almost reverently. Some swore they saw him whisper under his breath. Others said he looked haunted. The first twist came on December 23, 1944. During a supply inspection outside Bastogne, an ammunition truck exploded without warning. The blast leveled a storage hut and wounded several mechanics. Investigators found the cause: an overheated modified M2 that had ruptured during testing. Fragments of the barrel bore markings identical to Briggs's blueprints. But what stunned them wasn't the malfunction. It was what they found welded into the gun's receiver: his initials. Rumors spread fast. Commanders demanded answers. Who had authorized this version? Where were these weapons coming from? But every trace led back to missing paperwork, phantom shipments, and one quiet captain who now stood among the wreckage, staring at the charred metal that had carried his name. That night, as snow fell over the camp, Briggs sat alone beside a ruined jeep. The men around him celebrated another day survived, but he couldn't join them. The weapon he built for vengeance had turned on his own. The thing that once gave him purpose now looked back at him like an accusation. Still, orders came to keep using the modified guns. They worked too well to abandon. In the chaos of war, morality bowed to necessity. The M2 became legend, a sound every German patrol learned to fear. Even tanks hesitated when they heard it. Yet, in every burst, Briggs felt the echo of that explosion, the reminder that he'd crossed a line no blueprint could erase. As the Battle of the Bulge raged, he followed an infantry company deep into the woods. Reports of malfunctions had surfaced again: barrels melting, feed covers jamming from overpressure. Briggs insisted on inspecting them himself. He told the commander he needed to see what his hands had done. But somewhere far from the snow and fire, in a quiet office back in Washington, Major Carson finally connected the last thread. A shipment manifest, dated weeks before Briggs's reassignment, bore an odd signature. Not an officer's, but a civilian's. A handwriting match confirmed it was Michael Briggs, the brother who had died 2 years earlier. The signature had been forged. That discovery changed everything. Carson realized Howard Briggs had used his dead brother's name to authorize illegal transfers, a haunting tribute, or perhaps a confession. The dark reason behind the weapon's existence wasn't just revenge. It was grief weaponized into obsession, a man turning pain into steel until he could no longer tell one from the other. As the war entered its final months, the army chose silence. The truth would have damaged morale and stained the name of America's most feared weapon. They labeled the investigation inconclusive. Briggs remained in the field, unaware that his secret had been uncovered. The weapon continued to roar, defending the line and breaking the enemy's will. But destiny was closing in. One last test awaited him, the night that would seal both his legacy and his downfall. When dusk fell on January 8, 1945, a convoy halted near the village of Houffalize. The men prepared their guns for a final defensive stand. Briggs knelt beside one of his modified mounts, adjusting the recoil buffer by hand. Snow hissed against the glowing barrel as he murmured a calculation under his breath. He didn't notice the tiny crack forming near the chamber, the same flaw that had doomed the earlier test. The first burst was flawless, a stream of light across the trees. The second jammed. Briggs leaned in, wrench in hand, trying to clear the feed. Then came the flash, a blinding white bloom. The explosion was heard half a mile away. When the smoke cleared, the gun was gone, and Briggs lay motionless beside it. Soldiers dragged his body from the snow, silent. In his coat pocket they found a folded telegram, creased from years of handling. The edges were worn, the ink faded. It was the message that had started it all, the notice of his brother's death. They buried him near the frozen road under a wooden cross marked simply engineer. No rank, no record, just a man who built something that refused to die. The war rolled on without him, but whispers of his work spread quietly through the ranks. Some called it cursed genius, others divine intervention. Yet none could deny its power. When the snow melted and spring came to Europe, the forests still bore the scars, twisted trees, shattered tanks, and empty shells from the devil's typewriter. April 1945, Germany. The war was dying, but it refused to die quietly. Smoke coiled from villages the Allies had taken only hours earlier. Bridges burned, fields smoldered, and rivers carried the ashes of the Reich downstream. The sound of engines never stopped, but among it all, one sound still stood apart, the pounding rhythm of the M2.50 cal. Across Europe, the weapon had become a legend whispered by both sides. Germans swore they could tell the difference between a standard Browning and what they called der verdammte Donner, the damned thunder. They said it was faster, heavier, crueler. They weren't wrong. In the aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge, word of Captain Howard Briggs's death had reached Washington. The file landed once more on Major Carson's desk, a simple envelope marked deceased, non-combat incident. But attached to it was something new, a sealed report from an anonymous engineer in the 8th Air Force. Inside were blueprints, serial data, and a statement written in careful ink. We never built it from scratch. The design came to us pre-tested, hand-delivered by a man who said he only wanted it used for justice. Carson understood instantly. Briggs had personally smuggled his prototype to England years earlier, long before official channels even noticed it was gone. The engineer's note ended with a single chilling line. He said it wasn't about winning. It was about making them remember. The army buried the file again. But history has a way of bleeding through cracks. In May 1945, as Germany surrendered and the Allies took stock of their spoils, an intelligence officer named Lieutenant Frank Reeves was assigned to inspect captured German weapons in a warehouse outside Munich. Row after row of MG-42s, Mausers, and Panzerfausts lined the floor. But tucked in the corner, he found something strange. A disassembled American M2.50 cal with markings in both English and German. Its barrel was engraved with small, deliberate letters. HB. The weapon had been recovered from a downed Messerschmitt Me 410. Somehow, the Germans had obtained one of Briggs's modified guns, perhaps from a captured bomber, perhaps from the black market of war. They had studied it, reverse-engineered parts of it, and even attempted to mount it on experimental aircraft. But their report concluded grimly. Stabilization unreliable. Excessive heat. Uncontrolled power. It was the ultimate irony. The enemy that had inspired Briggs's obsession had tried to copy his creation and failed. The weapon built from grief had become too wild for the men who had caused it. Carson wrote a final memo before closing the file for good. The Briggs variant contributed significantly to the success of Allied operations. Recommend classification, top secret, not for reproduction. Officially, the name Briggs never appeared in the war record again. Unofficially, his fingerprints remained everywhere. In every airfield, every armored column, every gunner who owed his life to the thunder that came from the M2. After the war, when the U.S. began documenting its technological triumphs, the Browning .50 caliber stood as one of the most enduring weapons ever built. Few knew that beneath its evolution lay the work of one man consumed by a single emotion. Fewer still realized that his improvements had been quietly integrated into post-war designs. By 1950, as the Korean War erupted, a new production batch of Brownings rolled off assembly lines with subtle internal changes, improved buffers, reshaped bolts, enhanced cold weather reliability. None were labeled Briggs model, but every blueprint carried traces of his unauthorized notes. The Army had adopted his design, purified it, and erased his name. Some would call that justice. Others might call it theft. But for history, it was simply how legends are born. Years later, in 1963, a retired Major Carson visited a museum exhibit at the Aberdeen Proving Ground. Inside a glass case sat a single M2 machine gun, restored to pristine condition. The plaque beneath it read, "Prototype, Experimental Recoil System, 1942, Engineer Unknown." He stood there for a long time, remembering the memos, the signatures, the photographs of a man standing beside a weapon that had changed war itself. He knew the truth, that behind every unknown engineer, there was often a story the world wasn't ready to hear. He pressed his hand against the glass and whispered, "You did it, Captain. They'll never know, but you did it." Outside, the sun reflected off the Chesapeake Bay, and for a moment the ripples looked like muzzle flashes frozen in time. The second twist comes not in discovery, but in silence. When historians decades later finally declassified parts of the file, they found an unmarked envelope tucked at the back. Inside was a photograph, Briggs at Aberdeen in 1942, standing beside his prototype, snow falling around him. On the back, written in faded ink, were just 5 words. "They felt it, Michael." All of them. No signature. No date. But those words bridged the war's noise and the quiet that followed. The dark reason that turned the M2 into the Germans' nightmare was never about hate for an enemy. It was about one man's refusal to let grief fade. His brother's death had forged not only a weapon but a legacy, a machine that embodied every ounce of loss, rage, and purpose the war could summon. That is why, even today, the Browning .50 cal remains the longest-serving machine gun in military history, a weapon older than most nations' armies, still mounted on vehicles, aircraft, and ships around the world. Each time it fires, somewhere in that echo lives the heartbeat of Captain Howard Briggs, the man who gave the Devil's Typewriter its soul. As Europe rebuilt, soldiers returned home to silence. But in forgotten barracks, veterans told stories around the fire. They said there was a gun that sounded like a storm, that when it spoke, even thunder stepped aside. They said it wasn't just a weapon. It was the voice of every man who refused to be forgotten. No medals were ever pinned to Briggs's chest. No parades bore his name. Yet his work reshaped the balance of power, turning a standard American machine gun into a symbol of unstoppable resolve. Time passed. Decades turned the snow of the Ardennes into memory. But when modern gunners train on updated M2s, when they feel the recoil and hear that deep, relentless rhythm, they're touching the same design born in a lonely lab during the darkest winter of the war. They may not know the story, but the steel does, and maybe that's how it should be. Because some legends don't belong to medals or monuments. They belong to the rhythm of a weapon that still speaks for those who can't. If you listen closely to the footage from Bastogne, amid the chaos and the shouting, you can still hear it, the pattern, the tempo, the sound of a promise kept. The Devil's Typewriter, the Reaper, the heartbeat of vengeance turned into history. So the next time you see that old, massive machine gun mounted on a tank or a helicopter, remember, it wasn't built only for war. It was built from grief, love, and a single man's vow that those who started the fire would one day feel its heat. And as the story fades back into the snow of 1944, the narrator's voice softens. The forest is quiet again. The smoke clears. Only the sound of wind moves through the trees, whispering over cold steel. History doesn't forget. It only waits for someone to listen. If stories like this remind you that behind every weapon lies a human story, of courage, sacrifice, and the thin line between invention and obsession, then don't leave without being part of this mission. Tap that like button if this story moved you. Share it so others can feel the same fire. And subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends for more untold stories from the shadows of history. And before you go, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single one. Whether you're in New York, Berlin, Lagos, or Sydney, your comment connects you to a piece of history that still echoes today. Because somewhere in that echo, the devil's typewriter still writ. Yes,